Super Star Wars was my jam for the SNES. As a 16-bit Sega-leaning kid during this particular era, it easily got the most play from me, second only to Nintendo's big-ticket franchise exclusives. I love it, but let's be honest with ourselves, it's kind of a sloppy mess. Technically impressive and visually stunning with incredible stereo blasting audio, but good god, the bombardment. Empire was more of the same, but seemed to kick off with a challenge level on par with some of the later levels present in its predecessor. I recently played through the pair on easy for the first time in decades to refresh my memory leading up to indie here, and yes, I said easy. How I was able to blast and shroop my way through these on the higher difficulties back in the day is beyond me. A struggle it is today to cut through the Empire's armies. Sculptured software can be thanked, praised, or condemned for their efforts here depending on where your opinions lie. Super Return of the Jedi just sorta unceremoniously dropped out of nowhere in 1994. I remember visiting the local video game shop at the end of the year, intent on purchasing Donkey Kong Country when I first saw it. At that point, Jedi had already dipped to about $30, only a few months after its initial release, so I bought both. The third Star Wars felt a lot less super, padded levels with even less polish than its brethren. I played it for a few hours, reached the Wicket the Ewok stages, then proceeded to focus all of my remaining attention on DK. Rare is going to be a company I reference a few times here. As I said, I was definitely more of a Sega guy in this era, but the original NES had my heart during the 8-bit days. Rare were one of those developers who were all over the damn place on Nintendo devices as far back as I can remember, but their early work outside of Battletoads and maybe RC Pro-Am kind of rubbed me the wrong way. In my humble opinion, they didn't get good until Donkey Kong Country and peaked on the N64. Their early games under Ultimate and Rare felt like examples bred on an entirely different planet. I liken these efforts to classic Doctor Who. Yes, there's a charm, but part of the fascination is in the weirdness. Factor 5 felt the same way. In my mind, this German company followed a similar trajectory to Britain's Rare. Naturally, being European developers initially focused on early computer kits was what made them both seem so alien to a North American kid like me. Both appeared to create games with loosey-goosey controls and weirdly vibrant color palettes more suitable on Amiga hardware. Turrican, Factor 5's biggest early success. It never landed with me. Even as a Commodore 64 fan, it felt off. Rainbow Arts developed the original, but around half a dozen members would go on to form Factor 5, so I always get it all muddied up in my aging brain. I've attempted to bust down the barrier between myself and this series for decades. I respect it and appreciate its existence, but it's still too chaotic. The biggest draw for me has always been Chris Hulsbeck's music, some of the best ever created for the medium. It sounds so smooth on the Amiga. Killer. Okay, so where am I going with all this? Well, Factor 5 were given the Indiana Jones license by LucasArts to fashion a Super Nintendo title in the same vein as the Star Wars games. Only here, all three are crammed into one cartridge, and it feels a bit rushed. Both it and Super Return of the Jedi dropped within a third of a year from one another. It's immediately evident that they're companion pieces despite the difference in developers. I didn't know until years after owning it that they weren't bred from the same source. In my mind, Factor 5 created Jedi 2 because it felt so different, but that's not the case. All I knew while playing these both back in the day is that they felt off in a way that I could never properly articulate. Indiana Jones's Greatest Adventures is as challenging as the Super Star Wars trilogy, but it's also very uneven. The difficulty isn't gradual. Some stressful stages are sandwiched between far simpler ones. Ultimately, a lot of stuff feels rushed, perhaps even unfinished. All three films are represented in the order they were released. Choosing a specific adventure from the title screen isn't an option, but short, easy-to-memorize passwords are offered between geographical locations. I really dig how they're designed around the ancient symbols. Delta, Omega, Phi, Psi, Sigma. It's a simple addition that makes me feel like I'm solving an archaeological puzzle. Plus, there's this tiny little indie icon. adorable. Raiders kicks things off. It's a strong start with well-designed levels and carefully considered enemy placement. There are beautiful graphical details right off the bat with rays of sun beaming through the cracked cavern ceilings, excellent environmental shading, and interactable leaves scattered across the ground. Baddies and traps are relentless, but after playing the Sculptured Software series, this wasn't exactly a huge surprise. Factor 5 has eliminated the timer, which makes it an option to tackle these areas at one's own pace, something I definitely recommend for newcomers. Indy animates smoothly and looks great in every position. Harrison Ford's likeness was also handled well in the Super Star Wars games, specifically in Empire Strikes Back, but I'd say this is even more impressive since they only had one controllable character to design. His whip and gun stances are spot on, but I'm partial to the exaggerated punching poses. It's so satisfying pounding on everything with these massive meat hooks, and they even managed to replicate that iconic impact sound from the films. So good. The controls are super tight and responsive. They've eliminated the double jump, which is perfectly reasonable as we're no longer bustling around space in a sci-fi setting, and using the whip to swing from specific points laid out is very satisfying. This is an awesome mechanic that almost always feels reliably natural. The second best whipping in all of 16-bit gaming, right behind Super Castlevania 4. Super Castlevania 4. Indy can snap in 5 directions. Downwards isn't an option, but that's where the gun comes in handy, as it can be fired every which way with an exaggerated pose that perfectly captures that Harrison Ford style. Grenades are the final option. These are easy to collect in most stages and can be devastating to large groups of enemies or big bads. At first I didn't rely on them too much, so I always had a huge stockpile, but when level design starts to go from fair to sloppy, they almost become a necessity. Rolling is possible by holding the A button, but this is a case of over-designing and altering something that really didn't need fixing. In Super Star Wars, it was only necessary to hold down and jump to evade certain obstacles. Here, it feels comparatively sticky, which makes it a bit less reliable. There are traps in a lot of levels that require quick reactions, so I feel that the tinkering they did here makes me less confident in my movements. Fortunately, it can also be used as an attack, which is a good thing as there are tons of rats throughout the entire game that can't be shot or whipped at. What sucks is that Indy is damn near uncontrollable as he's rolling around, and his body bounces off enemies like a pinball. This could have definitely been improved. Holding the action button down with a whip or pistol handy makes it possible to repeatedly attack in any given direction, but punching with the shoulder buttons needs to be inputted manually for each hit. Be sure to keep an eye on what you're grabbing from satchels placed in the environments or other Ninja Gaiden style goodie icons, because Indy automatically switches to whichever melee weapon he stumbles upon last. It's kind of lame that he loses his weapons after each stage, but his fists are always an option, so it's not that big of a deal. I've never been in a situation where a weapon wasn't available close to a checkpoint, but still, it was an odd design choice. I suppose they were probably trying to follow the action scenes from the source material as closely as possible, but it just ends up feeling like a half-baked idea that doesn't pay off in a meaningful way. Personally, I would have preferred if they had dumped some of that time into making Jones's outfits match those from the film. Seeing him dressed up in his spelunking gear in the Shanghai nightclub just doesn't look right. Nitpick? Yeah, but in all of the Sculptured Software titles, there were a variety of characters to play as. Plus, I can't help but think Factor 5 were under a lot of pressure or ran out of gas. Perhaps both, because after an impressive beginning, Greatest Adventures suffers from a severe drop in quality. The cutscenes drive the narrative forward quite well at first. Sure, they could have lifted a few more screenshots from Raiders to make the lengthy expository text a bit more exciting, but if you read along, it's coherent. The majority of the stages based off that first film are exceptional. Diverse action set pieces that seem to alternate between traditional platforming sequences to horizontal or vertical auto-scrollers. Vibrant colors, interesting challenges, slight branches in paths, great music that appropriately suits the environments. A few bosses, there's a relatively simple brief stage set at the digging site that has a wide variety of different enemies and hazards depending on the path chosen. Thumbs up. Well of Souls has some nice lighting effects with secrets around every corner, but this is the last of the inspired levels. From this point forward, the cutscenes are far less frequent, which is fine because I've seen the trilogy, but those who haven't will probably find themselves narratively confused. A lot of the big action set pieces that occur during the movie's second half are completely absent. The airport tarmac fight, the iconic vehicle chase, not even a murmur. Indy goes straight from the Well of Souls to a strange, unrecognizable canyon where his biggest adversaries are boulder-dropping birds in lieu of Nazi armies. It's hard to believe that these were the same developers who spent so much time nailing the sword duel in the market and recreating the unforgettable Peruvian opening sequence. This is a frustratingly lazy finale to the Raiders of the Lost Ark portion of this game. It barely resembles anything from the movie, and why are animals so hellbent on killing our playable protagonist? Rats, bats, wolves, monkeys, birds, they are all more common than despicable Nazi soldiers. The final boss is also embarrassingly half-assed here. After this, we're pushed straight into Temple of Doom, which is just... It's hard to think that anyone cared here. The first stage in the nightclub is a clusterfuck as gunfire shoots at Indy while the player vaults obstacles to obtain a cure to the poison he's been inflicted with. The background still looks great, and Factor 5 really knew how to take advantage of the hardware with some nice looking smoke effects here, as well as the foreground crowds in the earlier market stage that feel directly inspired by the cantina in Super Star Wars or Jabba's palace in Jedi. The next stage looks good as they milked the hell out of that brief awning moment from the film with a platform section that is all sorts of screwy. Who designed these major downtown streets in Shanghai? Someone needs to be held accountable for this gigantic crater in the road. That's a hazard. Here's where I need to talk about the vertical exploration a little bit. The Cairo market set piece from Raiders had some clunky bits due to rapidly respawning enemies and movable objects in place to access higher regions. I didn't complain about it there because overall the layout makes sense. Here in Temple of Doom, it relies a bit too much on trial and error to make progress. Some awnings tear under Indy's weight, others don't. Railings need to be carefully navigated to gain some upward momentum. There's this car that keeps driving back and forth. It's all a mess. Not only that, but the difficulty seems to spike in certain stages in an unnatural, unearned way. Almost as if the developers simply knew they had to keep dialing up the challenge due to the scaling of levels, but couldn't care less about adding new, interesting traps. Most of these areas are also very short. From this point on, the enemies no longer feel deliberately placed in a thoughtful way. They are haphazardly thrown in wherever the player needs to go in an effort to steal lives. Our first Mode 7 vehicle stage comes next as Indy careens down the Himalayan mountain slopes while Willy and Short Round are apparently wasting away in the wreckage of the crashed plane. It's a pretty ugly level that doesn't hold a candle to the majority of similar scenes from the Super Star Wars trilogy, but I have a soft spot for its arcade-like qualities. Dodge the trees, make it to the end. It's like Rareware's slalom without the tight trouser bubble butt. Things switch up yet again as we're forced to solve a fairly simple maze to make our way through Pankot Palace. Very detailed and colorful. Finally, a new piece of music. Rudolf Stember did a remarkable job reworking the excellent John Williams soundtrack in 16-bit form, but, and this is a big but, the majority are from Raiders. From what I counted, 12 of the 18 tunes are based off that first movie, including the march piece. That means Temple and Crusade only have 6 fresh ones. Technically, the latter only has 2 since I've taken the final credits into consideration there. Again, the music is fantastic, but that final Indiana Jones flick had some exceptional tracks. The castle stage is missing the memorable Brunwald theme, possibly my favorite piece of music from the trilogy. It wouldn't be so bad if the game didn't have as many levels as it does, but after a while, hearing the same few tunes begins to grate on my nerves. Following this brief, yet admittedly clever little maze sequence are 2 of the laziest levels in the game. The background is decent, but completely static, and getting around these caverns feels extremely uninspired, especially since they play out almost exactly like the Rancor pit stages in Super Return of the Jedi. Bats are everywhere. The level design seems phoned in, and this is where I started to notice that enemies don't respawn all of the time. In Raiders, they'd arbitrarily reappear, but here, nah, they're just gone. Not that I'm complaining, it's just, as I keep saying, inconsistent. Save a few kids in the second part of these two stages and get the hell out in possibly the ugliest exhibitions of Mode 7 technology I've ever witnessed. The less said about this the better, but we can at least confirm that Willy and Short Round are indeed dead. Sculptured Software were able to fit C-3PO into the land speeder a few years prior, so what gives? It's at least an easy stage, shoot at everything, face off against Mola Ram in an underwhelming bridge battle, and we're on to the final third. Boss battles in Greatest Adventures are pretty forgettable. They're not necessarily bad, but most can be reliably eliminated by unleashing an entire stockpile of grenades or spamming the attack button. All but the final one require no pattern memorization, and most take less than a minute to take down. Crusade skips the entire young Indy portion of the movie, which is kind of expected as they've had to create a brand new character model. Like I said before, Sculptured Software managed to create a few playable protagonists, but whatever. By this point, it seemed this production team just needed to get this thing out. It's fine. Instead, we're dropped directly into the Venetian catacombs, my least favorite level in the entire game. Patterns. These began to no longer be a thing, starting with the projectile throwing enemies in the Temple of Doom. Raiders had its fair share of unreadable baddies, but most played fair. A specific amount of bullets, locked in spurts of lava that reliably shot out on a timer, pot-dropping locals, they all took breaks. Here in the catacombs, insta-death is everywhere, starting with the wave of fire that kills Indy immediately. At first I ducked down out of the way to parse the intervals, you know, as one does while playing a video game. I could be wrong, but it seems to occur randomly. If this is in fact the case, it's not fair in the slightest. Couple this with the bottomless pits that are tough to visually read, and you're left with a disaster. These glowing marbles exhibit safe platforms, but there's one part where I swear there's no way to safely avoid the fire. I die here every time. Suspiciously, it's right on a checkpoint, so I think the developers knew it was almost impassable. Extra lives are rewarded when 100 little orbs are collected, a la Mario coins, so it's entirely possible to eke your way through the game. 3 continues are provided on the normal difficulty, passwords are generously offered, and framed headshots of our fedora-wearing hero also add another tick to the life counter. The differences between easy and normal are negligible. I completed the game both ways, and the only noticeable change on the higher difficulty was that enemies seemed to take a few extra hits. While we're on the topic of enemies, it doesn't matter if you're fighting natives, Templars, or Nazis. Most of them are just palette swaps. More of an observation than a complaint. Brunwald is next. Are we inside or scaling the outer walls? It looks pretty nice, and human baddies are finally more plentiful, but they still seem randomly placed, and again, it's uninspired. Dad's just hanging out here. I mean, he has an umbrella. Poor bastard. It takes less than 5 minutes to get through this stage. I know I sound like a broken record, but it's like they're not even trying. Finally, a return to whipping. This sequence switches things up a bit, as it's necessary to escape the castle by swinging horizontally to the end. I know it's always best to be able to sell your product all over the world, but red X's in lieu of swastikas takes me out a bit. Maybe it was a Nintendo thing. Clearly a nitpick, but after having to hear this frantic action theme from Raiders yet again, I started getting cranky in my note-taking. This is also where I started noticing that all enemies weren't created equal, as some recoil upon being damaged while others don't. The motorcycle escape sequence is absent, but at least there's an adequate Zeppelin stage before one of the best looking examples of Mode 7 on the hardware. This biplane level is super sexy. Sleek effects, terrific control. It's tough as nails though. Enemies do so much damage if you're caught in their crosshairs, but it takes next to nothing to bring them down. Similarly to the Super Star Wars trilogy, there's a certain amount of baddies to eliminate in order to move on, but it's easier said than done. It's a bit finicky and probably not as well programmed as it could have been, but hey, it looks great. If you keep adjusting your altitude while strafing, it's a breeze, but tackling those bogeys head on will end in a quick death, over and over until you learn how to exploit it.
I've lost it.
Similarly to the last stage in Raiders, this next area is brief and underwhelming. It's just an excuse to place baddies in irritating spots to drain your life bar. To add insult to injury, dying here or the biplane level sends you back to the Zeppelin, so be careful. The less said about the boss battle on top of this Tinker Toy tank, the better. At last, the final level. It's expectedly pretty challenging, but looks decent and encourages the player to utilize all of the tricks they've learned so far. The movie trilogy opened with a series of obstacles within an ancient ruin and ended the same way, a brilliant full circle. They perfectly recreated this in Greatest Adventures with a much more difficult booby trap stuffed version of the very first level. Skip ahead a minute if you don't want spoilers. Generally I don't tackle final bosses in my reviews, but I feel like this one deserves a bit of attention, as it's the only truly challenging one in this package, with a well-conceived pattern. Better late than never. I know it may seem like I dislike Indiana Jones' Great Adventures, but that's not really the case. In a lot of my reviews, I tend to pick things apart. Commenters seem to think everything is black and white. Sometimes it's possible to enjoy something without defensively loving all aspects, or to simply have a more agnostic opinion. And that's what all these are. Opinions. Maybe I need to set the record straight by giving everything a grade? I don't know. The comparisons to the Super Star Wars trilogy are unavoidable. When I was younger, this was the Indiana Jones action game I had always wanted. The graphic adventures existed and were much more immersive, but they weren't platformers. This is a solid action title on the Super Nintendo. Factor 5 would later go on to produce some truly incredible games on different hardware, but I really feel as though they were rushed here, or blew their budget, or who knows. A Sega Genesis version was planned, but similarly to the Super Star Wars port, the plug was pulled for one reason or another. I still have fun playing this thing, and it'll never leave my collection, but I also wouldn't consider it one of the best action platformers of the era. Its good qualities exceed its faults, but overall I think I prefer Sculptured Software's take on Lucas properties. Greatest Adventures had a lot of potential, it just didn't land for me quite in the way that I had hoped. Next time on this failure of a channel, one final Indiana Jones game, so feel free to ignore it. 7.5 out of 10. Profeed 101. Let's see how these videos are doing. Well, I suppose Raiders was out there a little bit longer, but also it reached like 500 in a day. Last Crusade, huh? It's good thing I put so much time and effort into that. Well, I guess now I know why people continuously say like, comment, and subscribe on their videos. I think the only smart thing to do is to continue on doing what I enjoy doing and playing all these games for multiple hours. That sounds like a good idea.
He chose poorly.